Okay, good morning. Welcome to session 9, Authentication and Biometrics. In this session, we have 4 papers. And the first paper, the authors of the first paper were not able to come, and he will give the presentation over the Skype. And the first paper is on in-region authentication to be presented by Marmo Rashad. So please, you can start the presentation.
Thanks for the introduction. So our paper in region authentication is authored by myself and Dr. Rehan Safuginadi. I will start with providing background on the boundary technology that is used in our work, motivate our problem of in-region authentication, and state our goal. Then the system and threat model will be described. Then I will present the basic in-region authentication protocol, followed by security analysis and algorithm to optimize error will be followed by experimental evaluation. In the end, I will summarize our contribution and discuss future works. Location-based services have provided exciting opportunities to use position-related information such as location, proximity, or distance in improving system security, control access, and personalized service delivery. Secure authentication protocols are challenge response protocols between approver and the verifier. In a man-in-the-middle attack against these protocols, an attacker runs 2 simultaneous sessions of the protocol, one with an honest prover and one with the honest verifier. And by passing the responses of the prover to the verifier, succeeds in making the protocol accept their claim. Protection against this man-in-the-middle attack that does not have cryptographic solution can be provided if the verifier uses an estimate of the location of the prover, such as distance to the verifier as a second factor in authentication. Distance bounding protocols are challenge response authentication protocols that provide cryptographic authentication security with the extra guarantee that the user is within a distance bound to the verifier. Roughly, distance bounding protocols between a verifier and a prover involves sending a question, receiving answer, and computing the round trip time in order to put a bound on the distance of the verifier. The traditional distance bounding protocols can also be called distance upper bounding protocols, as they put an upper bound on the distance between a prover and a verifier. A typical scenario of distance upper bounding protocols is shown in this figure. A school authority allows Wi-Fi access only inside the school campus. The dual problem of distance upper bounding is distance lower bounding. As an example scenario, employees may not be allowed to access certain recreational services when inside the office premise. In 2015, JNETL proposed the first and only provably secure distance lower bounding protocol. A natural consequence is combining these 2 types of distance bounding. For example, students can only access Wi-Fi when they are outside the classroom but inside the school campus. This brings us to the problem of in-region authentication, where the registered users are offered a service when they are inside a policy region. For example, a project team can only access the proprietary project information when they are inside their workspace. In this type of scenarios, the authentication protocol must prove that user holds the secret shared with the service provider and the user is inside the region R. A straightforward solution for the above conjunction would be using cryptographic authentication followed by location verification protocol. Location verification systems are used to verify the location claim of an untrusted node. However, this solution will be vulnerable to attacks where prover changes their location in between authentication and location verification. Also, location verification protocols require the prover to claim a location, thus the prover needs to access the GPS signal, which might be a problem in indoor environment where GPS performs poorly. A better solution would be to use distance bounding. For a circular-shaped policy region, one can place a verifier at the center, and the region would be perfectly covered. However, for arbitrary-shaped region, false acceptance and false rejection error areas must be considered. Also, verifier configuration, such as number of verifiers, their location, their associated distance bounds, must be determined. The goal of this work is to design provably secure authentication protocols that allow the prover to prove this conjunction while minimizing false acceptance and false rejection errors. Our system model assumes a two-dimensional planar geographic area. This is represented by an array of points, each point representing a geolocation. U denotes the universe of all points of interest. For example, the yellow arbitrary-shaped region inside U represents a region of interest, or policy region R. All the verifiers in the system forms a set V. Verifiers are trusted to follow the protocol. Prover is untrusted and shares the secrets with all the verifiers in set V. An in-region authentication protocol is between a prover and a set of verifiers. Protocol outputs 0 or 1, denoting rejection or acceptance of the prover. Now, a ring is formed by a verifier running a distance lower bounding protocol and a distance upper bounding protocol. A pseudo-rectangle is formed by two rings centered at two verifiers. Now, approximating policy region R with a pseudo-rectangle R pi results in true acceptance, true rejection, false acceptance, and false rejection. We define error as the summation of false acceptance and false rejection. Minimizing error should maximize accuracy. Because the policy region R is fixed, accuracy can be defined as true acceptance minus false acceptance. We have defined three types of attacks for in-region authentication protocols, which have similarities with the attacks defined for distance bounding protocols. In regional fraud, a corrupted prover P star has the secret key and is outside policy region R, wants to prove that they are inside R. In region man in the middle, the corrupted participant who does not have the key but is inside R interacts with multiple provers and verifiers and uses transcripts of these protocols to succeed in the in-region authentication protocol. In collusion fraud, the assumption is that the corrupted prover does not want their long-term secret key to be learned by the helper, as otherwise the helper would have a better chance to succeed in future attacks in the future. Corrupted prover P star, in collusion fraud, if I have missed it, corrupted prover P star who is outside R, coded with a helper who is inside R, wants to prove that P star is inside R. In our basic construction of in-region authentication protocol, we consider only two verifiers, V0 and V1, with location log V0 and log V1. For given locations of the verifiers and respective upper and lower distance bounds, the protocol bounds the prover within a pseudo-rectangle. Now, the prover shares secret keys X0 and X1 with verifier V0 and V1 respectively. In the initialization phase, prover and each verifier pick two nonces and exchange. Each verifier also generates a response table and send it encrypted to the prover. Prover recovers the response table using all nonces and the shared secret. In the first exchange phase, each verifier takes 2n random challenge bits for n distance upper bounding rounds and n distance lower bounding rounds. Then a challenge bit is sent to the prover from each verifier for n distance upper bounding followed by n distance lower bounding rounds. Upon receiving the responses, verifier calculates the round trip time. In the verification phase, verifier verifies round trip times and correctness of responses to output 0 or 1. Some of you may have noticed earlier that there is the formation of an ambiguous region, the red shaded region in this picture. The proposed in-region authentication protocol requires the verifiers to use directional antennas for the challenge response phase. This is to ensure that a prover from the ambiguous pseudo-rectangle does not receive the challenges. In the security analysis, we introduced two special kinds of attacks. First one is prover movement attack. In this attack, a malicious prover pistar can move from one region to another in between distance bounding with V1 and V0. In this attack, a malicious prover pistar can move from one region to another. In this attack, a malicious prover pistar can move from one region to another in between DB with V0 and DB with V1. Prover responds to distance upper bounding and distance lower bounding challenges of verifier V0 while in region 1, and distance upper bounding and distance lower bounding challenges of verifier V1 while in region R2, and thus succeeding in the in-region authentication protocol. We have proposed a prover movement detection method without loss of generality. Assume that V0 is observing the distance bounding communication between V1 and V. Now, by listening to the channel between prover and V1 and also by communicating with V1, V0 can measure the distance between V1 and the prover. We have shown that any movement of the prover will result in distance measurement inconsistency between V0 and V1, and the prover will be rejected. A second type of attack is key splitting attack. Here, malicious prover pistar responds with distance upper bounding and distance lower bounding challenges of V1, and also distance upper bounding challenges of V0 while asking the helper to respond to distance lower bounding challenges. And the prover has linked its X0, key X0 to the helper, so that the helper will be able to respond to distance lower bounding challenges for pistar. The attack is successful because this key leakage will not directly result in a successful future attack by the helper alone. To be specific, to be successful in a future impersonation attack, the helper H requires both secret keys X0 and X1. We thwart this attack by including both keys X0 and X1 in generating the response to the challenge of each verifier, as highlighted in the proposed in-region authentication protocol. To get accepted in the protocol, a key splitting attacker pistar must share both keys X0 and X1 with the helper. Now, to make the proposed in-region authentication protocol secure against in-region fraud, in-region man-in-the-middle, in-region collusion fraud, we use the construction of a distance upper bounding and a distance lower bounding protocol. These protocols are provably secure against the three distance bounding attacks, such as distance fraud, man-in-the-middle, and collusion fraud. The given security theorem essentially states that successful attacks on in-region fraud, in-region man-in-the-middle, and in-region collusion fraud will result in successful attacks on distance fraud, man-in-the-middle, and collusion fraud for distance bounding protocol, respectively. If you can recall, we have defined the protocol error as the summation of false acceptance and false rejection error. In our paper, we have proposed an algorithm to optimize this error for 2 fixed location verifiers. In step 1 of the algorithm, we find the initial pre-rectangle that covers R completely. This is done by taking the pre-rectangle that touches the policy region on both sides. In step 2, the initial pre-rectangle, we divide the initial pre-rectangle into pseudo-rectangles of size delta. Delta is one of the parameters for our algorithm. In step 3, we convert the pseudo-rectangle into a 2-dimensional array with each element of the pseudo-rectangle determined by subtracting the number of true acceptance points, number of false acceptance points from the number of true acceptance points inside that inside each pseudoscore. Recall that true acceptance minus false acceptance denotes the accuracy of the system. In step 4, we apply the maximum sum subarray algorithm on the 2-dimensional array in order to find a 2-dimensional contiguous subarray with maximum sum. In step 5, we use the indexes, which is top left and bottom right of the 2-dimensional array, subarray, to determine the final bounds for the verifiers. We have provided proof of optimality of our algorithm, which is basically based on the fact that maximum subarray algorithm returns the contiguous 2-dimensional subarray with the largest sum. To evaluate the proposed optimization algorithm, we have taken Google images of 4 different buildings in our campus with resolution 640 times 640. Then we converted them into binary images. Now measurements including locations, distance, area, and errors are all in pixels. We have considered 4 cases in optimizing error, 4 approaches. The first approach is called the direct approach, where the policy region R is completely covered by the pseudo-rectangle formed by rings centered at V0 and V1, and being the nearest ring that contain all the locations of R. The resulting pseudo-rectangle, of course, is the smallest pseudo-rectangle covering R completely. The second approach is the implementation of basic error optimization algorithm that I have presented earlier. For the third approach, we have adjusted the verifier's location heuristically to observe the impact on the accuracy. And for the fourth one, the last one, we partitioned each policy region into 2 smaller regions and applied the basic optimization algorithm on each sub-region independently. The chart shows false acceptance, false rejection, error comparison among different approaches when applied to B1, B2, B3, and B4. The regularly shaped region B1 has the lowest false acceptance and false rejection errors compared to other relatively irregular shaped regions in all 4 approaches. Best found false acceptance and false rejection ranges from 0.81 to 5.16% and 3.89 to 5.58%. Best found total coverage ranges from 94.41 to 96.1%. We compared our approach with the one presented in previous work, which is Shastri's work on in-region authentication. Shastri et al., 5 nodes are manually placed inside a region to provide a coverage of 93%. In our approach, 2 nodes are manually placed outside the region to provide a coverage of 96.4%. It also reduces the total error from 7% to 4.1%. In some approaches, false acceptance is more tolerable, while in others, false rejection are more tolerable. The notable advantage of our error formulation is that it can be adjusted to capture the requirements of different applications. We keep the concept of a weighted error metric as in this expression. It can be seen from the figure that the increased weight for false acceptance reduces the false acceptance error. To summarize, we have motivated and defined the problem of in-region authentication, defined security of in-region authentication protocols for a region R, gave an efficient algorithm to minimize the protocol errors, proposed a basic two-verified protocol with provable properties, provided solutions for preventing key splitting and detecting prover movement attacks on in-region authentication protocols, and providing flexible error functions that are suitable for particular applications. Our future works will consider optimizing error under real-life constraints on the location of verifiers, the number of verifiers, and particular error function. Thank you.
Any questions?
I don't see what makes the difference between a region and the symmetric of this region with respect to the axis going through V0 and V1.
Sorry, cannot hear clearly.
So if you authenticate a region, I think that implicitly you will authenticate the symmetric of this region with respect to the axis V0, V1.
Can you hear clearly?
Yeah, I cannot hear clearly. Still cannot hear clearly.
Okay. I don't see what makes the difference between a region and its symmetric. So if you have two verifiers, V0 and V1, you can consider a symmetric of a region with respect to the straight line going through V0 and V1.
So yeah, maybe there is some problem on the
So it's better
microphone.
So it's going to come here to talk to.
I was saying that I wonder what makes the difference between a region and the symmetry of this region with respect to the axis going through V0 and V1.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so if I hear you correctly, your question is the symmetry of the region. That means, are you talking about the ambiguous region that we have shown in one of the picture? Is that your question?
Yeah, so probably just take this offline and maybe you can send by email. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just hearing echoes and yeah.
Okay, so let's thank the speaker again. The second paper is a formal analysis of distance bouncing with secure hardware, and it will be presented by Handa Curley.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about our new model that we construct for distance bounding protocols, assuming that we have a secure hardware. So we also define privacy model for this secure hardware. with the assumption of having secure hardware. Okay, first of all, I want to introduce you what's introduction. So, what is distance bonding? I think you have already heard in the previous talk. So, distance bonding is an authentication protocol, but it is different type of authentication protocol that you can imagine. It is between two parties, the verifier and the prover, and here the prover proves its proximity to the verifier and also its credential. And the verifier accepts the prover if the prover is close enough. And this type of protocols were introduced by Brands and Sham in '93 to defend against relay attacks. And relay attacks are valid attack for all contactless authentication protocols, and therefore we need distance bonding. So first of all, I will show you what is relay attack. In relay attack we have two parties, two adversaries. So here the first adversary is Cartman and the second adversary is Stan. They have their own devices, and we have our credit card owner butters, and the first adversary comes near the credit card and then receives a signal from the credit card and then relays it to the other adversary's device, and then this adversary relays it to the terminal, and then the same relay happens in the other way around. And what happens here is that so the terminal thinks that it is communicating with the credit card, and similarly the credit card thinks that it is communicating with the terminal. But actually what happens here is that the terminal accepts a payment while the credit card is outside of communication range, and this payment can be done without the card owner's consent. So you can see why we need a distance bonding protocol to defend this type of attacks. And also we have other type of attacks in distance bonding protocol that we consider in distance bonding protocols. The first one is mafia fraud, and also called man-in-the-middle attack. In this type of attack, we have an adversary who wants to authenticate a faraway and honest prover. So this is this attacker model actually covers the relay attacks, but here the adversary doesn't only relay the messages. It can also change the messages or replace with some other messages. And in distance bonding protocols, we also consider malicious provers, and for that we have three categories. The first one is distance fraud. In distance fraud, we have a faraway and malicious prover, and this malicious prover wants to show that it is close to the verifier. And the second one is distance hijacking. In distance hijacking, we have again a malicious prover, and this malicious prover wants to show that it is close by getting help from an anonymous prover. For example, here it's P prime. And the last one and the strongest one is terrorist fraud. In terrorist fraud, we have a malicious prover, and this malicious prover collaborates with an adversary in order to show that it is close. So as I said, terrorist fraud is the strongest one, but actually it is not possible to achieve this type of security because of a trivial attack. So the trivial attack is very simple. Assume that we have a faraway prover and an adversary who is close. The prover can just give its secret key to the adversary, and then the adversary can run the prover algorithm and show that this prover is close. Since it is not possible to have this type of security, in literature we have a weaker version of it, and I call it as terrorist fraud prime security. And in that one, we assume that the prover doesn't give enough information to the adversary so that the adversary cannot pass the protocol along later. So this assumption actually weakens the adversary model. We rely on the intentions of the adversary. So I consider it as a weak security model. So in order to achieve terrorist fraud security that I explained in the beginning, the real one, we need another model, and because of that we design another model. And also I would like to show the relations between all these attackers. So terrorist fraud security, the original one, implies all of them. And we don't have any relation between man-in-the-middle security and distance fraud and distance hijacking. And distance hijacking security implies distance fraud. Since we cannot achieve terrorist fraud security, what we have in the plain model is this. So basically we don't have any relation between the security notions. So before explaining this, our new model, I will show you the algorithms that we have in a distance bounding protocol. So in a distance bounding protocol, so I am explaining the public key version of it. We have key generation algorithms here, and two algorithms for the verifier and the prover. And we have a parameter B, as you see here. This B shows the distance bound. And at the end of the protocol, the verifier outputs accept or reject message, which is in the out V, and privately outputs the public key of the prover. We also have its symmetric key version. It is very similar to it, except that we have only one key generation algorithm, and the verifier and the prover share a key. And we don't have, of course, a private output because we don't have any public key in the symmetric key version. And this tuple shows a distance bounding protocol. So, in order to adapt, so we cannot use the classical distance bounding protocol that I showed you in the previous slide. Therefore, we define a new distance bounding protocol algorithm for our security model. We call it as 3-algorithm distance bounding. And here, so the verifier is exactly the same with the classical distance bounding. And so we have the same key generation algorithms. And differently, we have, again, a prover algorithm, but the prover algorithm only has the public keys. It doesn't have its own secret key. And also we have a hardware algorithm, which has the secret key and public key of the prover, and the public key of the verifier. And when I show such a tuple, I am talking about the 3-algorithm distance bounding protocol. Okay, so now I will introduce you our security model. So we call it secure hardware model. In short, it is SHM. And PM stands for plain model. So what we assume that DB protocols are run in a natural setting. We have some notion of time, notion of distance. And we assume that the communication cannot be faster than the speed of light. So this is a realistic assumption. And we assume that the adversary sees all the messages, and the adversary can change the destination of the messages. Also, the adversary can create polynomially many instances. So basically, it can initiate each algorithm, and also it can replace all these algorithms any location that it wants. And we have also another assumption, which is that honest instances cannot be run in parallel. So if an adversary runs a prover algorithm, then he cannot initiate the same prover algorithm at the same time. And these assumptions are also valid in the plain model. And differently in secure hardware model, we have some extra assumptions. So we assume that secure hardware is always honest, and each prover has its own secure hardware. And if the prover is honest, then only this prover can communicate its hardware. And if, again, the prover is honest, they are both at the same location. Okay, now I will define the security in secure hardware model, and we define it with the game. So in this game, we have verifier, provers, and their hardware. And we begin the game by running the key generation algorithms for the verifier and for the provers. And then after generation, we give it to the we give the public keys to the adversary. And the adversary can create many instances, as I said. It can place all the algorithms wherever it wants. And during the game, we have one target prover P, as you see here. And the adversary wins if there exists a verifier instance which accepts this target prover when the target prover's hardware is far away. And we define man-in-the-middle security as this. So during the game, in all such cases where the target prover is always far away and honest, in this case, the probability that the verifier accepts the target prover should be negligible. So if it is like that, we say that this distance bounding protocol is man-in-the-middle secure. So you see the cases here. So here we have only faraway prover, target prover. Here we have also adversaries. So the red ones are malicious parties. Okay, yes. And similarly, we define the distance fraud security. And during the game, in all such cases where all instances are far away, including the adversary and malicious provers, in that case, the probability that the verifier accepts should be negligible in order to have distance fraud security. So here, for example, this target prover is malicious and it is far away, and in such a case, the verifier shouldn't accept this target prover. And the last one is this, no, it's not the last one. The other one is distance hijacking security. And during the game, in all cases where all closed parties are the honest ones, the probability that the verifier accepts the target prover has to be negligible to have distance fraud security. And the last one is terrace fraud security. So this covers all of them. So it says that distance bounding protocol is secure, TF secure, if winning this game is negligible. And for example, here the target prover is here. Its hardware is far away, and there are also some adversaries. And in such a case, the verifier shouldn't accept in order to have TF security. Okay, so I defined this, our security in our new model. Now I want to show you what is the relation between the plain model and the secure hardware model. And before giving the relations, I want to introduce you some notations that are used in the theorems. The first one is PDUM. So PDUM is a dummy prover algorithm. Actually, it does nothing. So it only relays the messages between the hardware and the verifier. And the other one is PH, and again for the prover algorithm in the plain model. And we use it to convert a distance bounding protocol in secure hardware model into another distance bounding protocol in the plain model. assume that we have a 3-algorithm distance bounding protocol as this. And when we want to convert this protocol into the plain model, we can use PH. So PH actually does everything in order that H and P does. Okay, so the first theorem is very intuitive. It says that if we have a distance bounding protocol here in the secure hardware model, and if we convert it into another distance bounding protocol, dB prime, in the plain model as with using PH, in this case, if dB is man-in-the-middle secure, then dB prime is man-in-the-middle secure. And the other one is an equivalence theorem. And this is not very easy to see, but what it says is that, so assume that we have a distance bounding protocol dB in the secure hardware model and have a dB prime in the plain model, where the prover algorithm in dB prime runs the hardware algorithm in dB. So basically it's not direct conversion of it. And here the man-in-the-middle security of this dB prime is equivalent to the Terrace-Frost security of dB. And with these theorems we have some important results. So the first one says that if we have secure and correct, secure and correct distance bounding protocol in the plain model, like that, it's dB prime, then we can have a secure dB protocol in the secure hardware model by having a hardware which runs the prover algorithm of this dB prime. And there can be there can be some P prime as well, but we don't care the prover algorithm is secure hardware. We only assume that the hardware algorithm has to run the prover algorithm of dB prime. And in this case, we have a secure protocol. And if P prime is equal P, then even we have a correctness as well. And the other result is related with the proving the security. So if we want to prove the security of a distance bounding protocol in the secure hardware model, what we need to do is just convert this protocol to dB prime, where we replace the prover algorithm with the hardware algorithm and prove its man-in-the-middle security. And the last one says that if we have the distance bounding protocol, which is man-in-the-middle secure. It says that man-in-the-middle security and the security is equal for this distance bounding protocol if the prover algorithm is P down. So now in our secure hardware model, we can achieve this relation. So TF security implies all of them, so we only need to prove the TF security. And if we use P down, actually TF security is equivalent to man-in-the-middle security. And we also define privacy for the prover, because distance bounding protocol also protocols also take care of the privacy of the prover. And we modified the existing definition into our model. And we define it with a game. Again, we have the same parties as I said in the security definition. And in the game, we generate the keys of the verifier and the keys of the provers. And we pick to play left or right game. And then we give the public keys to the adversary. And the adversary can launch a protocol between a verifier and any prover. And can send receive messages to each instances. And it can also corrupt a prover. So we define two types of corruption. The first corruption is the strongest one. If the adversary corrupts a prover, it learns the current state of the prover and its hardware. So it basically learns the secret key. And the other one is corrupt too. And here we assume that if the adversary corrupts the prover, it learns all the memory of the prover, and also it can communicate with its hardware non-anonymously. Remember that in our secure hardware model, we assume that honest prover can only communicate with the hardware, but in this definition, if it is corrupted, then the adversary can communicate. And at some point, the adversary picks two provers. Two provers. So depending on being the left or right game, the game simulates one of them. And at some point, it can also release these provers and send another two provers. And at the end of the game, the adversary outputs B prime, and if this B prime is equal to B, then it wins. And we have two definitions. The first one is strong private. So distance bounding protocol is strong private if the advantage of winning this game with corrupt one is bounded by a negligible probability. And the other one is semi-strong privacy. A distance bounding protocol is semi-strong if the advantage of an adversary in this game with corrupt 2 is bounded by a negligible probability. So the reason of giving these two definitions is to have the similar notion of the similar privacy notion in the plain model. So the first one, strong privacy lets the adversary to do corrupt one. But when we look at this corrupt one, actually it contradicts with our assumption, because we assume that secure hardware are always honest. And in order to be more consistent with our definition, we actually believe that having semi-strong privacy is more appropriate in our model. So if we have semi-strong privacy, I think it should be enough in secure hardware model. Okay, so I'm done with the security and privacy model. Now I will introduce you some protocols that we design to be used in secure hardware model. As I said, in secure hardware model, if we have a man-in-the-middle secure distance bounding protocol in the plain model, actually we can use it as a secure one in the secure hardware model. And first I will introduce you MIM-OTDB. So in MIM-OTDB, MIM-OTDB is a symmetric key distance bounding protocol. The keys, the half of the keys correspond to the challenges, C, and the other half corresponds to the responses, R. And it directly begins with n rounds sending challenge and response bits. So in each round, the verifier sends a challenge, CI, it's the ith bit of C, and the prover checks if it is the same CI that it has, and if it's okay, it responds with the RI. And each sending of verifier always compute the round-trip time of sending the challenge and receiving the response in order to determine the proximity of the prover. So if, in the end, if all the responses are correct and if all responses arrived on time, then the verifier accepts the prover. And we can say that this protocol is man-in-the-middle secure if it is only run in one time. So because we are linking the keys. But with using this protocol, we can also, yes, I forgot to say, so the success probability of the adversary is bounded with 3 over 2 to the n plus 1. which is very close to the optimal security bound that we can achieve. So with using this one-time secure man-in-the-middle protocol, we can construct a secure man-in-the-middle secure protocol with multiple times. And this is also very simple. In the first phase, the verifier and the prover exchange nonces, and then they compute C and R by using a PRF function, where the key of the PRF function is their shared key. And then they just run one time this MIM OTDB, which is one-time secure distance bounding protocol. And we prove that it is a man-in-the-middle secure protocol in the plain model if F is a secure PRF. And with using this simple distance bounding protocol, we can actually achieve security in our security model by letting the hardware algorithm to run whatever the prover algorithm is running here. And here still we have the bound which is close to optimal security. And for the public key distance bounding protocol, we use an existing one, and it is called SIMPKDB. We only add an encryption to achieve privacy here. In SIMPKDB, the prover picks a nonce and sends it, so then it encrypts it with the public key of the verifier and sends the encryption to the verifier. The verifier learns the public key of the prover and the nonce, and then it randomly picks challenges and responses, and it encrypts it together with the nonce and sends the encryption to the prover, and then prover learns the challenges and responses, and after that they run one-time man-in-the-middle secure protocol. And we prove that it is man-in-the-middle secure, assuming that encryption and decryption is in CCA secure, and we prove that it's weak private, assuming that N prime and DEC prime is IK CCA secure. So IK is indistinguishability of keys. So weak privacy in plain models means that we don't let the adversary corrupt. So from this weak security, so we have only MIM security with this protocol, and we have only weak privacy with that protocol. Actually, we can have secure protocol in our secure and private protocol in our security model, secure hardware model. And here, what we do is we share the works done by the prover. So the prover encrypts the nonce and the public key, and picking the nonce and decrypting the encryption of the verifier is the job of the hardware. So the protocol is very similar to the previous one. And then the hardware and the verifier run MIM OTDB protocol. And we prove that this protocol is secure. I mean, it is terrorist fraud secure in our security model. And we also prove that it is semi-strong private by assuming that, again, with the same assumptions. So as a conclusion, I want to review what we have done. We prevent the trivial attack, so we constructed a model that we can actually prevent a relay attack, trivial attack, that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. And with secure hardware model, actually constructing efficient and secure protocols are easier. And also we can have higher privacy with this model. And we have the results that I showed you in the results of our theorems. So it says that man-in-the-middle security in secure hardware model implies man-in-the-middle security in plain model, and also man-in-the-middle security in the plain model where the prover algorithm runs only the hardware is equivalent to security of secure hardware model. And if the prover algorithm is dummy, actually the man-in-the-middle security in secure hardware model is equal to secure TF security in secure hardware model. So thanks for listening.
need the hardware?
No.
Can it be just mobile phone?
So you can imagine the secure hardware as a tamper-resistant hardware in the real life. So in mobile phone, for example, there is always a secure area. Maybe this secure area can do the computation that prover has to do in normal. Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank speaker again. Okay, the third paper in this session is KRB-CCN, Lightweight Authentication and Access Control for Private Content-Centric Networks. The speaker will be Ivan Novis.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper that's a little bit different from most papers. Here, this is not a crypto paper, it's more of a security service for an internet architecture that doesn't really exist. But that said, it's a candidate future internet architecture called Content-Centric Network. And it's an authentication and access control security service. This was work conducted at UCI, and my advisor, Jim Sedek, is also co-authoring this work. Okay, so before I start, just describe a brief overview. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about CCN in specific, as I assume that most people are not familiar with CCN, Content-Centric Networks. Is anyone familiar with CCN at all? And yeah, Tyler is, but he doesn't count because he's from the same lab. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on that, and then I'm going to talk about Kerberos, which is a security service for authentication and access control that's been out there for a while, since the 80s in IP networks, and that's what inspired our design of KRB-CCN. KRB and KRB-CCN stand for Kerberos. And then I'm going to go into the design, security, and implementation and evaluation of KRB-CCN. All right, so let's start with CCN overview. CCN, or content-centric networking, it tries to shift the emphasis of the current TCP/IP model from hosts, from addressing computers, to naming content. So what does that mean? Well, as we all know, the internet was designed a long time ago, and it was designed with a different mindset from it's kind of different kind of traffic from what we have nowadays. It was designed for exchanging messages and remote logging from terminals into mainframes. And nowadays, the bulk of the traffic in the network is actually for content distribution. So there's usually a server that hosts content, and then clients want to request content from that service. So CCN tries to bring that into the network design itself by having, instead of IP addresses for hosts, by having named content. And the content name, as you can see here, it kind of looks like a URL in reverse order. And the important thing here is that it increases in specificity. So it's a more general name segment followed by a less general, and so on, until you actually name the whole content. And this name will be used for routing in the network. And by doing this, this network architecture decouples content data from its physical location. And that enables getting data from the closest possible host or even a router in the network, instead of always going to the same server. And I'm going to illustrate this with an example, but the benefits of this is potentially better network utilization, lower latency, and so on. So before I go into the example, there are three types of entities in this network. There are producers, which are the entity that produces and publishes content under a certain name. And these entities, they own a name prefix, so they publish contents with a given prefix that's owned by them. And there are consumers, which issue these special types of packets, of network packets that are called interests. These packets carry the content names. And by issuing an interest, you expect to get a content of same name back. And there are, of course, routers that forward interests and contents. And the difference from IP routers is that CCN routers make cache content. So let's look at how this works with an example. So here we have the red circles here are consumers, consumer A and consumer B. The purple circle is a producer that owns a certain namespace, and let's suppose that it published the content with this name here, ndn/org/wikileaks and so on. And let's suppose that consumer A wants to issue an interest for this specific content with this specific name. Alright, so the consumer is going to issue the interest, and this interest is going to be routed just in the same way. It's kind of weird when we hear this for the first time, but it's routed just in the same way as an IP packet is routed. It uses longest prefix matching, but not in a number, in a name. And this, oops, I'm having trouble with this guy. Okay, longest prefix matching in the name instead of in a number. And this actually works, and this content will be routed towards the producer, but at every router that it goes through, it will leave this green square, which is a breadcrumb. And this breadcrumb will be used to, the string of breadcrumbs will be used to route the content back to the requesting consumer. And then the producer will issue the corresponding content for that interest, and the content will be routed back towards the consumer. And in this example here, these three routers are caching this content. And then, as it happens many times with popular content, another consumer that's close to the consumer A, here consumer B, might issue an interest for the same content. And this interest for the same content needs to have the same name, because every content is uniquely named. So the interest will go through R4 here, and it will reach R1. And R1 has a cached copy. You can reply locally to the request, and the same thing will happen. The content will traverse the same reverse path and reach consumer B much faster. So the interest doesn't have to go all the way from consumer B to the producer again, because R1 might have a cached copy. And this, of course, reduces latency and improves network utilization, because in this case, R2 and R3 don't have to process the new interest, because it was replied to locally by R1. So the way this is done is that it's differently from IP. We have now two routing tables that are used for forwarding. There is a pending interest table, which is how you would implement that breadcrumbs that I told you about. Is essentially the name of the content, or the name that's contained in the interest, which is the name of the content, or a hash of the interest itself, and the corresponding incoming interface from which the interest came initially. So by having this mapping, when the content with the same name comes back, you know where to send it towards the original consumer requesting that content. And that it's a privacy-friendly feature, because by doing this, you don't have source addresses anymore, as in IP. In IP, a packet needs a source address so that the packet can be routed back get to whoever is requesting, and here you don't need source addresses anymore, and consumers don't need to know who is requesting their content. So it's a privacy-friendly feature of CCN. And there's a forwarding interest-based, which is just the same as a FIB in IP routers. It's just a table used for longest prefix matching routing in CCN routers, based on the name. So, CCN security. The extent of CCN security is just this one bullet here. The architecture demands that content is signed by the content producer, and that's because optionally routers may want to verify signatures before caching content to make sure that they're not caching bogus content generated by an attacker, and also so that consumers can verify that they're receiving the proper content. And it was stated many times that before this is considered seriously as a replacement for the current architecture, there must be security services that are at least equivalent, but ideally better than those that exist in the currently deployed networking architecture, TCP/IP. So several services were proposed, including anonymity networks, those are Tor equivalents, VPNs, TLS like key exchange, and so on. And specifically about access control in content-centric networks, there are two flavors. CBAC, which stands for content-based access control. It relies on the inability of decrypting content if you're not authorized to access that content. So it mainly relies on a public key based encryption that so it relies on public keys of consumers and encrypting content under those public keys. And then unauthorized consumers will not be able to decrypt this content. And IBAC, it relies on the inability to issue or to derive a name for content if you're not authorized to access that content. And a caveat about IBAC is that for privacy-preserving content requests, it must be used jointly with CBAC because you still need to encrypt the content. So this approach is based mainly on encryption of content, seem to work, but they have some issues because they rely on the actual content producers to handle all the access control and authentication in the network. And the first problem is the overhead. The producers are responsible for handling the authentication and authorization themselves, and that might not be desirable, especially because in this network some producers might be very computationally restricted devices. So that's one problem. The second problem is consumer privacy. As I said before, in CCN the packets don't have source addresses, which is good because it preserves the consumer privacy. But if the producer of the content handles authentication and access control themselves and a convoluted kind of protocol, this implies sacrificing consumer privacy because the producer needs to know the identity of the requesting consumer. There's also a problem with policy changes because you might have several producers, several physical machines producing the same content in the network, and then if you want to have a policy change and you use encryption to enforce access control, you need to notify every single machine, every single producer machine of that policy change. And there's also a confidentiality issue because if you don't want to use public key encryption and instead use some other mode of authentication such as biometrics or passwords, that means that this biometric templates, passwords, or this biometric templates or password databases, they need to be stored at each producer because they're handling authentication themselves. So the question that we ask is, what else can we do for authentication and access control in CCNs? So that's the basics of CCN. And if you didn't fall asleep yet, you should be able to understand more or less how CCN works now. Okay, so what else can we do? And we looked back and we looked how this is done for private networks in IP, and it was reasonably successful done by the Kerberos protocol. So a little bit of history about Kerberos. Kerberos was proposed in the mid-80s, and it's been widely used for private networks and for authentication and access control in IP networks. And the key idea is that it separates the entities involved in the process. So there's an authentication entity, an access control entity, and services in the network. And these are logically separated entities in this authentication and access control framework. And as we observed, and as I'm going to try to describe here, it solves these four problems that I mentioned before. And it's a kind of something that wasn't done in CCN before. And but the disclaimer is this is suited for private networks because it's a centralized infrastructure. So it's not a solution for the whole internet. Okay, so one slide about Kerberos. Kerberos, as I said, separate this entities, and it's a three-round protocol. So we have first an authentication request, and this authentication request would generate a ticket, which serves or works as sort of a proof of authentication. So the client will talk to a server, and the server will verify the client identity somehow, and will reply with a ticket. And this ticket can be used further on to prove that the service has authenticated, and there's also some time stamping that goes on, and that he has recently authenticated. And then the second round of the protocol is an authorization request. So when the user, after a user authenticates and he wants to access a given content, he needs to provide this first ticket that he got in round one, this ticket that's called a ticket granting ticket, and it's called like that because it will be used in the authorization request to get a service ticket, which is a ticket that you can use to request the actual service. So in the second phase, based on your first ticket, granting ticket, your TGT, the authorization service, the authorization server will verify if your identity is allowed to access a given content. And then, if so, you get another ticket, this service ticket, and this can be used as a proof of authorization for a given content. And then the last round is the service request. So you give this proof of authorization to the actual service provider, and the service provider doesn't handle any authentication or authorization. It just check this service ticket that you provided, that the client provided, and if everything is fine, and if everything verifies, the service provider will provide you the data or the service you requested. And it supports authentication in both ways, so the service can authenticate the client, and the client can authenticate the service. Okay, so this is Kerberos, and now for KRB-CCN, which is this sort of mapping of Kerberos in this new internet architecture. So as I said before, Kerberos has 3 rounds, and here we also design KRB-CCN with 3 rounds, and the way we do this is by modeling this servers, this authentication server, authorization server, that we had in Kerberos for IP as content producers in the CCN architecture. So the entity responsible for authentication will be this TGT producer. So it's a special type of producer that produces a special type of content, which is a TGT, a proof of authentication. And the entity responsible for authorization is a CGT producer, a content granting ticket producer. So it issues this proof of authorization, which we call a CGT. And finally, in 3, the consumer can use CGTs to request content. So let's look a little bit deeper on how this works. So at the first part, a TGT producer is going to verify the identity, and if the identity verifies, it's going to issue this ticket, which is an authentication proof. Okay, this is the full protocol. I don't expect you guys to read this. I'm just going to point out the main parts here. So it starts with the consumer will issue an interest, and this interest can carry some data, and this first interest for authentication will have the name of the DGT. So it will be an interest like UCI/EDU/DGT, and this interest will be routed to the DGT producer, and it also carries the user ID, and here the consumer can claim any ID, but what's going to happen is that the DGT producer will fetch this user public key in its database, and here again it's a private network, so we assume that consumers register into this KRB CCN system, and also the local network producers will also register. So okay, the DGT producer will fetch a public key, and it will generate a fresh symmetric key here, and encrypt under the user's public key, generating this token. And there's all sorts of timestamping here going on also to ensure that the DGT is fresh. And it will also encrypt the DGT under this symmetric key KA, which is a symmetric key shared between the DGT producer, the authentication entity, and the CGT producer, the authorization entity. And the DGT will also include the same symmetric key that was freshly generated here. Now the main idea here is that because the token was encrypted under the user's public key, under the claimed ID, only the actual owner of this ID is going to be able to decrypt the token and get the fresh symmetric key back. So and that's the end of the authentication phase. And of course the consumer will get the DGT back, but the consumer doesn't have this KA, and it will not be able to decrypt or tamper with this DGT. By the way, whenever I say encryption here, it's authenticated encryption, so it's tampering resistant. Okay, so the protocol proceeds to the second phase, which is the CGT, the authorization phase. It gets as input a DGT, and it produces if everything verifies correctly, it produces a content-granted ticket, which can be used to access content. Okay, so this is it's a pretty similar idea. This is the authorization protocol. Instead of claiming an ID here, the consumer will issue an interest for a CGT, an interest that has a name, the CGT name, which again will be something like EDU/UCI/CGT, and that will be routed towards the CGT producer. And that interest will contain this character N here, which is a name prefix. So, and this is a point where this marriage between CCN and Kerberos actually works better than in IP, because in IP you enforce all of this by having DNS lookups and tying identities to network names. And in CCN, because you have the name as a part of because essentially the name is what you route in the network, you don't need to do that, and you can actually issue an authorization request for a prefix. So after you get this authorization, you can basically reuse the same ticket for everything that's every content that's under this prefix. So as I'm going to describe later, you can actually do this once and skip it for as long as your ticket is still valid. And you don't need one ticket per content. So the consumer will specify the name prefix that it wants to get authorization for, and will send the same TGT that was generated during the authentication phase. And then the CGT producer will decrypt this ticket. Remember that the CGT producer shares its KA with the DGT producer. And then it will be able to recover this KCGT and also get the user ID back. And then it will do a lookup in the policy, in the access control policy database, and we'll check if that given user ID should be able to access namespace with prefix N, with this prefix. And then if so, it will generate a fresh key again, and it will take the name prefix, the fresh key that was generated, and encrypt under the content producer, the actual content producer key. And it will generate a second token that will be encrypted under the same KCGT, which was recovered by the CGT producer by decrypting the TGT. And then it will send back a content granting ticket, and this token, which is encrypted under KCGT, giving the consumer a key that can be used to request content to the actual content producer. And recall that only the owner of user ID from the previous part of the protocol, only the owner of KCGT can decrypt this, and the only person that has KCGT is the owner of UID. Okay, so for the actual content production, what happens is that the consumer will issue an interest for the actual name, and the interest will have this format. It will be the same, it has to be the same name prefix and some suffix that specifies which content is being requested. And then the interest will also carry the CGT. And then what's going to happen is the content producer will verify that the CGT is a valid CGT, and if the name prefix in the CGT matches the name prefix of the interest, it will produce data, encrypt under the fresh key that was contained in the CGT, and send it back to the consumer, and only the consumer will be able to decrypt that. And then there's also a version that supports mutual authentication, and that version has 2 rounds. It's just a standard challenge response protocol, and that's useful when this content production, even though without this, an unauthorized consumer will not be able to decrypt the content if the content production requires a lot of computation. This helps preventing denial of service attacks. So, a few things that I didn't mention is that, actually this I mentioned, TGTs and CGTs can be cached and reused until the expiration date, and a good thing in CCN is that you can use the same CGT, the same authorization proof for different contents under the same name prefix, and by doing that you don't need to repeat all the 3 rounds at a time. You can just do the last one with the consumer, and you only do the second round again if you want to request content under a different name prefix, and you want to do the first one again if you need to authenticate again, if your single sign-on time expired. And the second thing that I didn't mention is that this whole process that goes on the consumer can be automated. We have that well described in the paper. It's just for reference here. So I think I'm a little bit tight in time, but we did implement this, and we evaluated the cost of this. By the way, one thing that I didn't mention, the first part, the authentication part, has a public key operation that could be replaced with a password, with a symmetric key encryption using a key that's derived from a password. So we implemented this. These are the details of the implementation and experiments. This is not very important. And we evaluated this in this minimal network topology containing only the main networking entities involved in this. And because we used the minimal networking topology because we wanted to evaluate actually the overhead involved with this. We didn't want to have any topology specific overheads. And we evaluate the processing time for each phase in each of these entities, the throughput and average runtime trip. So here the processing time it's as expected. The first phase, the TGT producer, this is for the one that has a public key encryption operation. It takes more time. The CGT production is reasonably fast, and the content production is a little bit slower because the content is 2 orders of magnitude more data than, in our experiences, 2 orders of magnitude more data than what gets encrypted in the CGT production. So here's the runtime trip for each of these requests. The yellow one is the baseline. This is a regular content production in CCN without any of, it's just an unprotected content. It's not a sensitive content, it's just the time for a regular CCN request. And these are in green is the time for a content request, blue for the authentication part, and red for the authorization part. And as you can see, it's not much more overhead as compared to the baseline, and it scales linearly. And the x-axis here is the number of simultaneously issued interests. So as you can see, as you flood the network with more interest, the response time increases linearly. And also for throughput, the main takeaway of this result is that is the benefit of TGT and CGT caching. This is the throughput. In blue here is the throughput with no caching at all. So the organization doesn't support single sign-on, and it doesn't support, and the consumer is always requesting contents for different, it's always requesting contents with different name prefixes. And the green one is the throughput if you cache both TGT and CGT, and you get much higher throughput. Okay, so to conclude, KRB CCN is a solution based on Kerberos for access control and authentication in content-centric networks. It solves those 4 problems that I mentioned in the beginning, and it also supports mutual authentication and consumer privacy, which is one of the good things about CCN is also preserved, because the final content producer doesn't have to be aware of who is requesting a given content. And there's also resistance to replay attacks, which I didn't describe here, but you guys can look it up in the paper. So with that, we'll conclude. Yeah, thank you.
As we are running behind the schedule, we are, if you have any question, we discuss offline. So now we have the final presentation of this session. The title is Authentication, User Deauthentication and Launch Time Attack. Mitigation with seated posture biometric. And it will be presented by Tyler Kosmelik.
All right, cool. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Tyler Kosmelik. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Irvine. That's where this work was conducted, along with my advisor, Gene Sudik, and another PhD student, Urchin Alster. So today, we're going to go a little bit into left field. We're going to talk about butts. We're going to talk a lot about butts. I'm introducing a new candidate biometric for continuous authentication and deauthentication based on the seated posture patterns of the user. Whoa, that's not the click. Okay, let's just click then. All right, so just a quick preview of what's going to be the flow for this talk. I'm going to start with a little bit of a general introduction into why continuous authentication is important, give some background, some current techniques for deauthentication. I'm going to move directly into the posture pattern biometric after that, describe our adversarial model, and then give some results from a prototype that we evaluated with some users in their workplaces. So, as I'm sure you all know, any meaningful security system needs some form of effective user authentication. Typically, we're moving on more and more to 2-factor authentication, which uses 2 of the 3 from this category, either something you know, your classic password PIN, something you have, some YubiKey, RSA token, whatever, and then a The third category is something that describes what you are or how you act. Typically biometrics. This can be either a biological biometric, which is something like a fingerprint or an iris scan or something innate to you, or it can be a behavioral biometric, which is something based on your actions, like a gaze tracking or arm movements or something like that. Unfortunately, these techniques only really confirm that a legitimate user is present at the initiation of a session. But as we go through our day in the workplace, we don't really sit still and provide continuous input. That's one of the things we can do, but we do a lot of other things too. I'm sure throughout the course of a regular workday, it wouldn't be too unexpected for someone to, I don't know, stop providing any input on their terminal and chat to a friend, office mate, step up, go to a whiteboard, participate in a Skype call where they're just kind of sitting there and listening, or maybe muting it and just rubbing their temples. All sorts of things that don't provide continuous input through any of the peripherals on their machine. Because of that, we need to know when a user is actually leaving. And it's often the case that, I'm sure it's happened to all of us, you occasionally leave without logging off. And as it's happened to me, as I'm sure it's happened to you, there have been times where you've left, forgot to lock your screen, someone's come in, you know, put an embarrassing Facebook status up or wrote you a cute little note. You've technically been the victim of a lunchtime attack. While it might have been just a cute little message, they could have done anything. They could have deleted your thesis. They could have sent some inflammatory email to your supervisor. Hell, they could probably go into your online banking that's, you know, already set up and just completely ruin you. So because of this, we need to periodically re-authenticate users, make sure that whoever's sitting at that machine is who initiated that session. We can't just check one time. So this brings the need for continuous authentication and, more specific, more germane to this talk, de-authentication. So continuous authentication is just pretty straightforward. You need to periodically just confirm that the legitimate user who started the session is still there. There's also a special case of this continuous authentication called de-authentication, which is just looking into when the user leaves. Once they're gone, you need to say, okay, I should terminate the session because they aren't here anymore. So, the goals are to just correctly identify, like I mentioned, when a user leaves, that A9 behavior as described before. Additionally, it's ideal to quickly detect any sort of circumvention attempts. If the user does momentarily leave, forgets to lock their screen, someone else comes in, you want to be able to detect that it is a different person. And to that, you also need to minimize the false rejection rate, FRR, which is when you're confusing the legitimate user's presence for their absence. Similarly, you want to minimize the false accept rate, which is when you are either confusing the legitimate user's absence for their presence, or confusing the legitimate user with some unauthorized one. And finally, we want to maximize the unobtrusiveness of this system. If it's something like a periodic finger scan or iris scan where you need to put your hand on a device or put your eye up to a high-def camera, you know, every 2 minutes, that isn't ideal. It's an extra user burden and it's likely to be rejected. So there is a default de-authentication, which is just your inactivity timeouts. Again, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. It's just some period of time. If you don't give any input through to your machine, it just locks you out. It reduces sort of the space of workplace activities to, am I continuously providing input or am I not? You get false rejects all the time. You can be, you know, participating in a Skype call and get that little, you know, you're going to be logged out in 2 minutes, but notification, you have to like muck around, or on the other end, if you leave and your timeout window is 5 minutes, which any potential adversary could know. They just walk in, start messing with your authenticated session, and you're in trouble. So there have been several techniques proposed. One older technique is keystroke dynamics. Basically, it looks into the way that a user types. It's pretty unique to them. Users can be successfully identified after about 30 seconds of typing with about 92% accuracy in current models. However, it still requires continuous active input to be given, so you can have false rejects during times that you aren't continuously giving input, which boils down to some of the problems in activity timeouts that you're trying to avoid in the first place. Additionally, there's a technique developed called Zebra, which basically you wear a wrist-mounted device similar to a Fitbit that has a accelerometer and a gyroscope, and it distracts your arm movements and makes sure that you know, if your right arm is moving up and to the left, the mouse should probably be moving up and to the left, and similarly, if you're typing and moving your arm in that way, those keystrokes should appear. However, it's been shown it's vulnerable to just an imitation attack. Someone sits behind you, looks at how your arm's moving, does that same action while doing any arbitrary behavior with the untracked arm. A couple more techniques. These are the last two. We're going to look into gaze tracking, which was proposed to use this high-definition camera to follow the user's eyes across the screen as they, you know, read content, watch videos, whatever. And it can successfully detect inauthentic users in about 40 seconds. But there's a couple of other problems. If you look away, your gaze can't be tracked anymore, and you get de-authenticated, and the the equipment is prohibitively expensive. Finally, there's a technique called fade which relies on the placement of mini wireless sensors that is communicating with your workstation, and when you get up and leave, your RSSI is going to change because the signal no longer has to travel through your body, and it interprets that as a cause to de-authenticate, but it can in no way discriminate people from one another. Your general change in RSSI is about the same no matter whom you are. So, now that we've gone through the background, I'm going to go into our proposed technique and the biometric behind it. So, the Authentication biometric is a combination of both physical and behavioral characteristics. We're going to be looking at the way that pressure is exerted on the chair that the user is sitting in while they're doing their activities. So physical characteristics such as hip width, their weight, but we don't directly measure it, and their leg length come into play, as well as the postures that they are likely to sit in. And we're going to go a lot more into detail on the posture patterns in particular in a little bit. So there's a couple of key advantages. First off, it's strictly passive. For the typical American worker, you're sitting down 30 hours out of a 40-hour work week, so there's no additional user burden to say, hey, you have to sit down. We like doing that already, I guess. It's not easy to circumvent. There's no sort of additional requirement for liveness detection. It's implicit in a body being present. There's no user observable specialized hardware. Again, they're just sitting in a chair. They're used to sitting in chairs. And for every activity that can be done while seated, it works quite well. In the case of getting up to, you know, write on a whiteboard or grab something from the printer real quick, you will unfortunately be de-authenticated, which kind of plays into the disadvantages. There are some edge case office arrangement standing desks, those weird yoga ball chairs that people use that cannot be instrumented in the way that our prototype is instrumented, and over the course of many days, the stability of this biometric is questionable. People shift in their weight a lot day to day, and posture is pretty well linked to mood. If you come in one day, you know, you were up very late the last night, you're very tired, you're more likely to slouch than if you come in well rested. Similarly, if you come in sick, things like that, you're going to have a different pattern of postures that you adopt instead of what you would do on a hale and healthy day. So we're now going to go into the adversarial model. We have two adversaries. They're both sort of variations of the insider lunchtime attack adversary. So in general, insider attacks have been reported to be estimated at about in between a quarter and a third of crimes in industry, and typically it's some disgruntled employee who has physical access to sensitive information or just to workstations in general. And importantly, they don't want to be linked back to the attack. They want to have some way to repudiate any claims that it was them who was responsible. So, specific to the posture pattern biometric, we divide our adversary into casual, who is just aware of the deployment of authentication, and they are going to try and just physically imitate the posture of their victim without the use of any extra equipment. And the determined adversary, who is aware of authentication. They might have had some way to sniff sensor data. They can precisely measure the victim, and they construct either some sort of like physical model, maybe out of ballistics gel or some sort of mannequin of someone's lower half, or they construct some sort of pneumatic or hydraulic contraption that delivers precise pressure across the sensors on the chair itself, which is a little bit more involved. The physical model, of course, would be very bulky, hard to bring in, and the pneumatic contraption would be harder to deploy. When you sit down, you typically do so all at once. You don't instrument, you don't instrument 16 distinct points over 16 distinct time intervals, unless that's how you sit, in which case, more power to you. So our actual prototype, we used a typical, average rolling chair. We instrumented it with 16 1-inch radius circular sensing resistors. We hooked them up to a pair of Arduinos, and then directly lined that into the workstation that the users were currently sitting at. Our instrumentation was a little bit expensive for the prototype. It was about $275, but once you get up to the scale of a medium-sized office of 30 to 50 users, it falls to under $150 just to bulk pricing of these small sensors, as well as getting just the chips from the Arduino instead of buying the whole thing. So we took these 16 sensors and instrumented them in accordance to some earlier work in posture detection. So these were strategically placed in order to get just the highest information gain across the 16 available sensors. You can see that 10 of them are on the bottom of the chair in that right half of the image, concentrated mostly over the point of contact of the lower thigh on both legs and the edge of the chair. And then 6 of them were actually across the back, looking at sort of like points of contact for the lumbar and some of the higher vertebrae. So with this prototype, we ran a user study with 30 subjects, 10 of them female, 20 of them were male. They were in their sort of own office environment. We brought the prototype to them, and they sat on it for 10 minutes while they just sort of did what they would normally do. This resulted in the collection of 1,200 frames of measurement every half second. Each of the 16 sensors just recorded the pressure. So most of the data ended up looking like this. This is a pretty interesting example of a user who, after about 2 minutes of being seated, folded his left leg over his right leg, and you can see the increased posture on the right leg of the increased contact from the leg fold. And then after about a minute, he unfolded it and the pressure returned to normal. There are many artifacts like this throughout the user data, just sort of indicating the different patterns of postures that each of the users adopted over those 10 minutes. So with that, we used a random forest classifier to see if we could identify users from 1 minute of their posture data across the other 9 minutes of collected data. In general, it was very successful. There were actually 3... Oh man, okay, I'm laserless. There were 3 users that were confused with one another quite a bit. You can see it's that F6, F7, and F8 column that had quite low true positive rates. They sat cross-legged in their chair. It was quite strange, but they had a posture that was very poorly adapted for our sensor placement, and because of that, their data was confused with one another a lot. You can see that as well looking at false positive rates. Even though it's still at or less than 1%, it still was a outlier compared to the rest of the subject data, and that's due to just some people of similar builds sitting in a quite different way from everyone else, but the same relative to those 3. Additionally, we created a anomaly detector to evaluate the applicability of this biometric for continuous authentication. So what it would do is it would take the first 5 minutes of that 10-minute collected data and treat it as training data, and then every 3 half-second frames after that, evaluate them and classify each frame as either an extreme, an outlier frame or not. If all 3 are considered outliers, the user would be rejected, and if any of them are considered to be within the bounds for a reasonable within the bounds of regularity, that data is then added into the training data. So under this method, it was never the case that a legitimate user was rejected for their own data, and a little bit over 90% of imposters were rejected at that first 1.5 second frame, with everyone being rejected by 45 seconds. And people who lasted out to 45 seconds were again those 3 women who sat in a strange way. Unfortunately, it just didn't match well with our sensor placements. So finally, I'm going to sort of bring everything together. We believe that the authentication biometric can be used for deauthentication. Additionally, it can be used for identification reasonably well. We have our true positive rates for identifying users out of a pool of 30 was a little bit over 94%. And our continuous authentication was always correct for legitimate users. We also assert that the casual impersonation, that is someone who just sits down and tries to mimic the posture of some victim, is unlikely. From our user study data, again, about 9/10 of imposters were immediately rejected, and everyone was rejected by that 45-second mark. And we claim that the determined adversary is impersonation, that is using either a physical mold or a set of actuators to impersonate a victim, is at the very least logistically difficult. It would require further study to really dig down into how hard that would be to pull off. Which kind of builds into our sort of future work. One thing that we really want to do is a longitudinal study, just follow a smaller set of users day to day for a week, just to see the longevity of these posture patterns as people's sort of moods change throughout a week. We would like to do a workplace evaluation for general acceptability. One big problem with biometrics in general is that people are uncomfortable with them. They don't like the idea of their physical characteristics being stored. Hopefully, using something as unobtrusive as this will be more acceptable. And finally, we would like to conduct an adversarial study, focusing primarily on the determined adversary, just to see how, again, logistically or physically difficult it is to pull off that task. And that wraps everything up. I know y'all want to go to lunch, but if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
We may have one quick question if you have. Okay, so let's thank speaker again and all the speakers of this session.